Good morning, everybody. Here we are again in our third session for this week. First, I want to express my appreciation for your dedication and how committed you are to open the videos every day and try to learn. Thank you so much for that. As usual, we're going to prepare our books and start with our lesson. Today, we're going to have the Cambridge Checkpoint book. We're going to start with Unit 6, and we're going to have 4 points to cover. We're going to start with the meaning of cliché. We're going to find out what's the meaning of cliché, and we're going to have many examples for that. Then, we're going to have 5 main stages to storytelling, how to plan your story. Then we're going to move to the summary of the text in pages 70 and 71. We're going to try to apply the things that we learned in the storytelling, the stages, on this text. Finally, we're going to have a grammatical part about relative clauses using who, which, or whose to connect sentences. The first concept that we're going to deal with is cliché. And notice that the pronunciation is cliché. What's a cliché? I bet that you've heard about this concept before. Cliché is an idea which has been overused to the point of losing its original meaning or effect, especially when at some earlier time it was considered meaningful. Well, what does that mean? When you use something so many times that it's not that interesting anymore, that's cliché. We have this thing even in our life. Sometimes we invent something, we start with something that is really funny and really interesting, and then we use it so many times to the extent that some people would see it as a silly thing. So that's pretty much cliche. Now we're going to have some examples given in your book about it. But before we continue with the examples, I just want to point that cliche is not necessarily a bad thing. Yes, it can be uh, figured as a bad thing. However, sometimes in literary works or in poems, poet or whoever or authors, whoever is writing, they use it for a certain reason. When you use cliche, people understand it in a better way since it's already used so many times. So when you want to convey an idea, you can do that through a cliche. It will be easy for people to receive this information. So, here are the examples given by the book. You have the definition, which is very similar here. A cliché is a predictable idea, event, or situation. So, what does that mean? It's the same idea that it's very predictable since you hear it all the time, that it's very known by now. So here we have some ideas about cliché. The first one, traveling back or forward in time. The first time this happened, it was very interesting. However, now we see it happening all the time in many series, in many movies, even in some novels. So, since it's been used so many times, the idea has become cliche. Moving to the other one, arriving on a planet never before visited. I'm sure that when somebody wrote this, maybe in the 50s of the last century, it was so interesting. However, when people are using it over and over again, that's a cliche. Other examples can be given. Moving to a new and strange house, having a dream which reveals something which happened a lot in old novels or even the new ones, being sent on a mission to defeat someone or something, being rescued at the last minute. Well, that happens, let's say, in most of the movies, in most of the series that we watch, that somebody is rescued at the end or at the last minute before he or she dies. Discovering a code or secret, and finally, being misjudged and banished. We can have many and many examples about that. Whatever is used a lot, it's called cliche. Moving on to a whole different topic. Here we have 5 main stages to storytelling. When you're getting ready to write a story, you shouldn't write arbitrarily. However, you should have a plan and you have bases that you would base your story on. So, these 5 stages are very important. To start with the first one, it's the setting. And we're going to explain what's the meaning of setting in the next slide. After that, you would have characters, which is extremely important. No story can be done without characters. Then you would have a problem, followed by a crisis. And finally, you would have the resolution. We can explain each one of these alone. So let's start with the first one. To start with the first stage, which is setting, setting means time and place. Most of the literary works, when you start reading a story or novel, you have the place where things were happening in addition to time. Sometimes time is avoided, however, place is usually given. So, what is the importance of time and place? It helps in building an image in your mind. You like live the story when you know where was the place and what was the time, day or night. And it helps in another thing, which is setting a tone or mood of the story. For example, if you're reading a story and it starts with thunder and lightning, storm, you would know that things there were not happening for like a funny or let's say a happy thing. You would know that it was a gloomy thing. However, if you're talking about very nice weather, it might mean the opposite. So, what are the details that can be described as it's given here? Time of the day, the time of the year, the time in history, like the exact year, the scenery, the weather, the location. All these things are important here. Moving on to the second stage, which is having your characters. Characters are very important. You cannot write a story without characters. Who would do it? So, what are characters? They are the people or animals in the story. Why did we say animals? Many stories have animals as characters, not people, like George Orwell's Animal Farm. Sometimes the characters can be ghosts, like in Hamlet, he had his father coming to him appearing as a ghost. Many creatures can be characters here. Moving on to the third point, which is very important. We call it a problem or conflict. You cannot write a story without a problem. If you're describing a life of someone without problems or without anything happening, the story would be extremely boring. So, you need to have a problem, something that moves the events. So, what's a conflict or a problem? The problems that the characters face. So, what's a problem? It's something known by all of us. We all face problems sometimes. However, a definition is given here. The problem is something that is causing trouble for one or more of the characters. Here we reach something that is much related to the problem. It's the fourth stage and it's called crisis. What's the meaning of crisis? It is the moment of highest tension in the story, just before the turning point, when a decision has to be made that will determine the story's outcome. What does that mean? The author here has planned something, has planned events. These events can go in a bad way, then they reach the worst way possible. This worst way, worst point, is called crisis. Nothing can happen worse than that. So, the point that everything changes is called climax. So, let's read the definition of climax, and it's much related again to crisis. Climax is the turning point, the action or decision that determines the outcome. Sometimes the crisis and climax appear to be the same moment. When when things go in the worst way and they change at this moment, crisis and climax are the same. Every time, whenever we have the worst thing that may happen, of course, the solving of this situation should appear based on the writer's vision. So here we have something called resolution. What's a resolution of the story? It's the solution, simply. So, how the problem was solved. Every problem in each literary work should be solved somehow, even in the worst way, if you have a tragedy or something, or in a good way in most of the stories. Now, since we learned the five stages of storytelling, starting from the setting, which means the time and place, with the characters, with having a problem, then taking the problem to the highest point, which is called crisis, then having your resolution, which is the solving of the events that were happening. Now, we should be able to apply the things we learned on our text. This text is going to be in page 70 and 71, entitled The Messenger. So, I would advise you to stop the video right now and try to read the text. As you read, find where was the place or time. Remember, sometimes you may find the place, you may not find the time, or the opposite. You can find the characters, you can find the problem, how did it start, then you would have to find the climax or the crisis in this story, and finally you would see how things were solved. What was the ending of it? So stop the video and start working on that. After that, the answers would be given by me. Okay, if you read it and finished, I here made a small synopsis for the story. And you remember the meaning of synopsis? It was summary. So I have a small summary for our story, The Messenger. We will read it together. Even if you couldn't read this uh, large text, we would have it here in this small synopsis. There was a king called Krishnadeva Ray who ruled the kingdom of Vijayanagar, and he had a faithful minister or advisor called Tenali Rama. Other ministers wanted to harm Tenali Rama because they were jealous, so they had a plan to put suspicion in the king's heart towards Tenali, calling him treacherous and spy to other kingdoms. Tenali was kicked out of the kingdom by King Krishnadeva. However, Tenali went to other kingdom and talked to the king there, telling him that King Krishnadeva considers him a friend and that the spies were the ones that are making problems between the two. So the two kingdoms turned the hatred into peace and friendship because of Tinali, and he returned to his king and was honored with higher position and the love of his king. Remember here that I didn't mention details because that's the rule of making a summary. You just mentioned the important events. I mentioned the characters, I mentioned the place, I mentioned the real thing that happened and the problem and how was it solved without any other unnecessary details. So, from this synopsis, this summary, we can find our five stages. We would have them in the next slide. So we're going to start with the first stage. We're going to find out what was the setting of this story. So the setting was the kingdom of Vijayangar. Of course, you couldn't find the time because it's not mentioned at all, only the place. Now, moving on to the second point, which is characters. How many characters do we have? We didn't have less than 4 characters. So we start with King Krishandeva, Tenali Rama, other ministers, and finally we have the king of the neighboring kingdom, the one that Tenali Rama talked to. Then we move on to the problem. What was the problem of this story? That other ministers want to harm Tinali by saying that he's a spy and he's a treacherous man. Then we have the crisis. What was the crisis? The highest point the events has reached or have reached. We have Tinali was kicked out of the kingdom. So this is a very important event. It was the most event that had tension with it. And finally, how things were solved. Tinali made the two kingdom friends and returned to his place by setting all the story. We didn't mention all the details, of course. After finishing all the topics related to literature, here we move to grammatical part. This part is about relative clauses using who, which, or whose. We already had an idea about that in Global English Book, and we solved so many exercises about putting who to link sentences. So, who, which, or whose are called relative pronouns as we know. Why do we use them? We use them to add extra information. We would have examples about that later. So, in addition to having extra information, of course, you would have to link two sentences, to connect two sentences using these relative pronouns. So, in the first sentence, you have two different sentences. The first one, I met Ralph. The second one is, Ralph is a new employee. You notice here that Ralph is mentioned twice, so why not joining these two to add this information that he's the new employee? The sentence would be, I met Ralph, comma, always notice before you put who, which, or whose, you would have to put this comma. So I met Ralph, who is the new employee. Notice that the second Ralph was taken off because we don't need to repeat. We use the pronoun who. The second sentence would be, I like the car that we saw yesterday. So how would we do that? I like the car, comma, which we saw yesterday. Notice again we had comma before which, and which replaced the car, the second one, because we don't need to repeat it. We should know how to differentiate using who, which, or whose. Whenever you have people, you should use who. When you have objects or things, you would use which. And whose is used for ownership to show possessions. So, here we would get to know it in a better way to solve exercise number 1 in page 37 in your workbook. So, try to open the workbook and try to solve these 5 sentences. The first one is already solved. Now we would start with A. Try to do it and then we will do it together. Okay, to start with A. The strange noises frightened the children. The children decided to leave the house. The house also had an unpleasant smell. Notice here that children is repeated twice, so these two sentences can be linked with one of the three pronouns that we have. Then you have the house also repeated twice, also can be connected. So, how to do it? The answer would be as the following. The strange noises frightened the children, who decided to leave the house, which also had an unpleasant smell. So we have a comma before who and which, and the sentence was linked in a very good way here. To deal with B, which is slightly easier since you have only two sentences, let's see how would the solution be. I would like you to meet Sherlock Holmes. Full stop. Mr. Holmes is a famous detective. Notice here that Sherlock Holmes is a person. So what do you think we will use? Should we use which or whose? We don't have any possessions here. So we would say, I would like you to meet Sherlock Holmes, who is a famous detective. Notice again, the comma was not forgotten. Moving on to C. The owner of the house was away. His wife had been in hospital recently. Okay, this one is a little bit different. You cannot say the owner of the house was away. Who, his wife? That would be totally wrong. To say which his wife even doesn't work. So notice here we have ownership. She is his wife. So the answer would be the owner of the house whose wife had been in hospital recently was away. Then we have D. She said she had not noticed the alien. Full stop. The alien had been following her for several hours. How would the solving of this one be? It would be alien. Do you think we should use which or who? She said she had not noticed the alien. Which or who? Both of them could work. Why? Because alien is not a person to say who, while it can be considered an object. So both which or who can be used. Finally, we have the sentence, there was light coming from under the attic door. The door was locked. How would the answer be for this one? Notice that the door is object. So we would say, there was light coming from under the attic door, which was locked. That was all for our lesson today. I hope that you understood everything that was being explained here. For any questions that you have, please put it in the comments section and I will answer it with pleasure. I'm really thankful for your dedication. As we said in the beginning of the video, see you next time.